Welcome to another episode of the Midnight Investigator, where we take another alternative look at moments in history. Okay, we're reopening a Victorian case that's been blurred by time, retold so often that two different eras get mashed into one. The story of Spring-Heeled Jack isn't one clean story. It's a name that moves. Most people don't realize there are effectively two Jack periods that get mixed together. There's the London Panic of 1837 to 1838. And then there's a later set of scares in the 1870s that reuse the same label. So we'll do this the way you do it in a real inquiry. We'll look at both eras briefly, check whether they truly match, and then narrow down to what we can actually anchor to the record. First, the later era. In the 1870s, you see reports tied to things like the Peckham Ghost, the Sheffield Park Ghost, and a later military-linked story based around Aldershot. The key point is the behavior in those later reports often reads more like a roaming ghost story. There's a lot of leaping, sudden appearances, and public hysteria, but it's not consistently the same kind of close-range assault detail. And the time gap matters. If you are trying to treat this as one offender, you're asking us to accept decades of silence and then a re-emergence with a different style. So we log the 1870s as what it most likely is. Later scares that borrow an already famous name. It's still part of the legend, but it's not the strongest base for a factual investigation. Now we go back to where the story becomes serious. London, late 1837 into early 1838. During a time when fear spreads fast through a city that is darker at night than people imagine today. Victorian London had gaslight, but it also had fog, unlit lanes, and long stretches where someone could step out of the glow and vanish into the shadows. And that's the atmosphere where the first wave grows. Reports circulate about a figure who appears suddenly, frightens victims, and escapes in ways that sound impossible. Here's the part that should make any investigator pause. A large amount of the early material is anonymous. Letters, rumors, and secondhand claims. That's not useless, but it's not a conviction. But one detail gives the panic weight. In January 1838, the issue reaches Mansion House, and the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, addresses it publicly after receiving complaint letters. That doesn't prove the stories are all true. It proves something else. It proves enough people were frightened enough that it reached the top of civic attention. And once that happens, the city changes. When authority speaks the name out loud, the name spreads. And the rumors multiply. So what do we have that is stronger than rumor? We have two incidents that later writers repeatedly treat as the clearest anchors from that first period. The first is Jane Alsop, reported in Old Ford, on the 19th of February 1838. The scene begins with a knock at night and a claim of authority. According to her account, a man said he was a police officer and told her to bring a light because Spring-Heeled Jack had been caught nearby. That detail matters because it's practical. It's a classic tactic. You borrow authority to get the door open, you pull the victim into the threshold, and you control the moment. Jane goes outside with a lamp. Then, in her description, the figure becomes something else. There are claims of a cloak, a frightening appearance, and an assault involving scratches and torn clothing. Her account also includes the most controversial detail in the entire story, a report of blue and white flame. It's the detail that makes people lean towards supernatural, and it's also the detail that gets repeated the most. So, although this is the first incident that clearly reaches the police record, it almost certainly isn't the first time the figure was talked about. The giveaway is in the setup itself. The man at the door doesn't just attack. He uses a name. He tells her Spring-Heeled Jack has been caught, as if the neighborhood already knows exactly who that is. Now, it suggests the legend was already circulating before Jane Alsop reported the incident. And yet, when we go looking for earlier cases, we find mostly smoke, anonymous letters, secondhand rumors, and stories without names or clean documentation, and certainly no police reports. It leaves an uncomfortable gap at the start of the timeline. Then, 9 days later comes the second incident. Lucy Scales reported in Limehouse on the 28th of February 1838, walking with her sister through a passageway. In the account relayed to police, the figure is described as cloaked and linked to a small lamp, the kind a policeman might carry. Lucy reports a sudden burst or puff of blue flame toward her face. She collapses as she later suffers serious fits and agitation that a surgeon attributes to extreme fright. These two incidents are not the whole legend. They are the two best known, most repeatedly cited anchors from the 1838 period. Everything else in the first wave is stories of encounters, near misses, and frightened whispers in different districts, many without names and without clean documentation. So when you strip the myth down to its hardest core, the reality is seen in a different way. The core is not dozens of verified attacks. The core is just 2 key reports involving 2 young women separated by 9 days in East London, in a city already primed to believe the worst. Now we look at how the police responded, because this is where the story stops being just print and becomes procedure. After the Alsop assault, the family don't treat it like folklore. They take it straight into process. Mr. Alsop appears at Lambeth Street Police Office with his daughters and gives their account to Mr. Hardwick, the magistrate. Statements are taken, details are tested, and a reward is even mentioned. Then the investigation starts, and it follows people who were near the scene at the right time. A key witness soon comes forward. James Smith, a coach wheelwright. He says he was in Bourbonder Lane when he heard screams. He hurried forward and encountered 2 men, a man known as Pan, a bricklayer, and Thomas Milbank, a carpenter, walking away from the area at the exact time. Smith's testimony doesn't stop there. He claims he meets them again later that night, overhears an incriminating exchange, and says that Milbank grabs the wheel he's carrying and taunts him with the words, "What have you to say to Spring Jack?" Smith then goes into the Morgan's arms, says the 2 men follow him in, and he asks the landlord who the man in the white shooting jacket is, and is told it's Milbank. On the strength of that testimony, Payne and Milbank are brought in for examination at Lambeth Street and questioned for hours, with multiple witnesses called and the Alsop sisters recalled so their evidence can be tested against what's being alleged. Both men deny the assault. Milbank admits he was very drunk, and the hearing bogs down in contradictions and extra sightings, until the process ends without a clean identification or formal charge that closes the case. So the police are on the case and fail to come up with any suspects. And once that happens, the press goes into overdrive. A name like Spring-Heeled Jack is too good to waste. So where does that leave us, if we keep it factual? It leaves us with a short, intense window in early 1838, where 2 incidents become the spine of the story. What can we responsibly say about the suspect based on those 2 reports? Well, a cloaked figure is central. A sense of sudden approach, shock, and escape is central. The fire detail appears in both reports, but it is also the least stable, because it is the easiest to exaggerate and the hardest to prove without physical evidence. And then the leaping, the thing that gives Jack his name, and repeated in most reports. However, we are left with multiple plausible explanations, none of them perfect, and all of them more interesting than a simple answer. One theory is a local offender using disguise and fear as a weapon, choosing vulnerable moments near doors, passages, and lanes. Another is multiple offenders, copycats who realize the city is already terrified and decide to play the part because panic gives you cover. Another is the influence of theater and popular entertainment. So let's look at the traveling circus theory. We have costume, disguise, and cheap sensationalism are all part of the setup. However, we have checked the period record for a touring circus angle, and the one major traveling outfit people tend to point to was in America at the time, not working in London. So the circus came to town theory doesn't really hold up for early 1838. That pushes us back towards something more local. Fixed venues, street-level showmanship, and the kind of theatrical tricks you could learn without ever joining a traveling circus. But it also comes with a problem. Anyone performing that openly in public would be taking a huge risk of being recognized, followed, or caught. And then there's the dockland angle, especially for Lamb House. This is river London ships, warehouses, crews, and overseas trade moving through narrow streets at all hours. In that environment, it's not impossible that a visiting seaman or traveling performer attached to a ship could get overconfident during a layover, try to frighten someone for sport, and then disappear back into the movement of the port, either because he had maritime connections or simply because he knew how to blend in and vanish. But we need to be honest. None of these theories can be proven. The record doesn't give us a neat identity, a confession, or a forensic ending. What it does give us is something more sinister in a way. It shows how 2 alarming incidents, plus civic attention, plus newspaper repetition, can create a figure that never truly dies. So did an unknown entity wreak havoc in Victorian London? Or did Victorian London, for a brief window in 1838, create a monster out of fear, darkness, and 2 reports that were frightening enough to echo for generations? Either way, the result is the same. The Alsop case, the first to clearly reach police attention, already hints that Spring-Heeled Jack is in existence before it ever hits the paperwork. The attacker uses the name as if she should recognize it. That suggests the story is already circulating in the streets before the first clean entry in the record. It also rules out the traveling seafarer idea because the 9-day window becomes a lot larger. We also have to accept that Jane Alsop's account is the only direct source for the most extraordinary details. There isn't a clear, independent witness beside her confirming the same face, the same claws, the same flame. That doesn't mean she lied. But it does mean we have to leave room for shock, darkness, and the reliability of how they remember it later. Then we have the Scales case, and the evidential shape changes. Lucy Scales is not alone. Her sister is with her. The aftermath is witnessed. A doctor is involved. The report moves through a recognizable complaint path. It's still strange and it's still frightening, but it's not just a single person's testimony floating in the fog. Now look at how the authorities handle it. In the reporting we have, police don't treat it as Spring-Heeled Jack, as a supernatural entity. They treat it as an assault. They look for a suspect. They question local men based on testimony. And even when two individuals are brought in, they still cannot identify the offender in a way that closes the case. That's where the newspapers do what newspapers have always done. They connect the dots for the public. They repeat the sharpest details. They harden a rumor into a character. Spring-Heeled Jack becomes less a person and more a headline that can absorb every similar fear. So the most grounded conclusion is also the most unsettling. In early 1838, we likely have at least 2 real incidents that seriously frightened people in East London, serious enough to reach civic attention and police procedure. But the legend that survives is built by repetition. A name, a pattern, a shadow. And decades later, in the 1870s, new scares appear and the old name is reused. That revival doesn't prove continuity. It proves the power of the label. It's one more reason the myth outgrows the record, even if the cases themselves were never truly connected. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that episode. You've been watching The Midnight Investigator. If this interests you, please like and subscribe. We'll be back with more investigations. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and remember, question everything. Don't let someone else do your thinking.